There are only 3 basic ingredients that make up mead: honey, water, and yeast. Simple, right? Well, there's a little bit more to it than meets the eye, so let's break it down. We'll start simple, with water. Can you use any kind of water? Yes. Should you? It really depends. In some places, tap water is absolutely fine, but if you have a high amount of iron, sulfates, or other compounds that could negatively impact your mead's final taste, then you can just buy bottled water from the shop very inexpensively. The general rule of thumb I've seen people go by is if your tap water is good enough to drink, it's good enough to brew. So that's a few things to consider when choosing where you get your water from. Next, we have honey. Now, you can use pretty much any kind of honey as long as it's actually honey and not just super cheap honey that's basically sugar syrup. If you're serious about making mead, there are a few really important things to know about honey. Firstly, is that there are different grades of honey. Ideally in mead making, we want to be using what's known as raw honey. This is a honey that has been unprocessed, pretty much taken straight out of the beehive and put into a bottle. This form of honey is absolutely the best for mead making. It might cost slightly more than supermarket honey, but it's worth it for the benefits that you get in your flavour and overall quality of your mead. You can use cheaper, non-pure graded honey, but it might not be as good. If you're unsure about mead making and just want to start out, you can use supermarket honey, and it should turn out just fine. But keep in mind, if you do, it won't have the best flavour that mead can offer. So be warned. To find raw honey, reach out to your local beekeeper, or just Google raw honey and your country, and you should find an online vendor. I, for instance, use a company called the Edinburgh Honey Co. They have some great prices on purchasing in bulk, and if you wanted to get honey at a great price and also help support the show, please check the links in the description to use my affiliated link. They are really great, and I've been using them since day one, so it's a really fantastic opportunity to get some great honey. So that's a crash course on honey. But what about yeast? There are actually different types of yeast. There's champagne yeast, wine yeast, and other non-alcoholic yeast types like bread yeast, as well as beer yeasts, ale yeasts, etc. When it comes to making mead, we ideally want to use a champagne yeast or a wine yeast. This is due to the yeast leaving the best flavour profile in your mead, because each yeast will create slightly different flavours, so it's important to research what flavour each yeast imparts. When looking at yeast, another thing to consider is temperature range. Each yeast will have an ideal fermentation temperature range. Some are larger, such as Lalvin EC1118, which can ferment from anywhere from 10 degrees Celsius to around 30 degrees Celsius. Others, such as Lalvin D47, have a much smaller temperature range. Lalvin D47 has a fermentation temperature range of between 15 degrees Celsius and 20 degrees. So what could happen if you keep your yeast above and below those temperatures? Allow me to explain. If you keep your must too cold, the yeast will go dormant and stop fermenting. Usually this isn't too bad though, as once the must heats back up again to its fermentation range, the yeast will start fermenting again. Obviously you want to avoid this, as you don't want fermentation being dragged out over the course of many months, due to lots of stalling and restarting. On the other hand, if you do keep your must too hot, the yeast can begin to get stressed out and produce off flavours, which we call fusels. Now these off flavours can sometimes mellow with time, but some may never go. This again adds time to how long it takes to go from mixing the ingredients to enjoying a nice mead. Also, if you really want to go above your temperature range, you may even kill your yeast entirely, so be careful. And that's why it's good to know the temperature range you keep your house at during the time of year you want to ferment. For instance, here in the UK during the summer, I tend to use EC1118 as it can handle temperatures up to 30 degrees, but in the winter I can use D47 due to my house being between 15 and 20 degrees. The ideal fermentation range for D47. In this video so far, I've only spoken about Lalvin yeasts, and that's because I actually haven't got around to experiment with other brands. Now, I really do plan to. Some other brands that I've heard good things about are Red Star and Y Yeast, but be sure to research the specific strain of yeast that you're thinking of buying and check what other mead makers might have to say about it. One last note. I'm not going to go too in-depth on it in this series, but it can get quite complex. But your yeast will need nutrients. To keep things simple, I suggest using 5 grams of wine nutrient per 5 litres. This should be added when adding the yeast solution to your must. If you guys did find a strain of yeast and wanted to ask questions, or even had any questions related to mead making, check out the description for a link to the Discord. We have a server called the Mead Hall. This server is home to over 1,000 mead makers from all around the globe, some with decades of experience of mead making under their belt. It's a great place to learn how to get into brewing. It's actually where I first learned how to get into mead making, so be sure to check them out and let them know that I sent you. And that is it for this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll be seeing you in the next one.